Yeah.
Anybody, please welcome to this walk and talk. It's, I hope, not too much talking, because I have to do it, but it's quite a short walk, about absolute outside 2 hours, unless I run off at the mouth very badly indeed. You may wonder why we're starting in a place like this, and I'll explain that fairly shortly. But before I start, I've just got to tell you one or two things. Try and keep together during the walk. If you decide you want to drop out and something's more interesting, let me or somebody else know so that you're not missing, because we have to count you otherwise. There are one or two slightly problematic points. We have to cross the road here, Fabian Way. That's quite dangerous. Try and stay together. And there are one or two other roads, but you know, this is not a hazardous walk. People do sometimes fall into the South Dock because there aren't rails around it. I think we'll just ignore you if you do. You know, shouldn't be with us really if you fall into the dock. But just beware of this kind of thing. Our treasurer here in the middle, Andrew, is doing some video and photographs. If you don't want to be in those, just let me know privately, and we'll make sure you don't. But it's simply to publicise the event. So, Swansea Ramblers welcomes you. We hope if you're not a member, you might come and join. We hope you like us. We're meeting here because, believe it or not, despite this awful building behind us, this is a very important part of Swansea's old history, industrial history. And I'll explain that in a moment. This is a short walk, but in terms of time, it's quite a bit longer. Swansea, around about 1800, which is where I'm starting, was quite a small town. It ran from where the South Dock is now, right the way up the High Street to round about the crossing just above the castle. And then it went eastwards a little way and down Portland Street and back to the coast. And 6,000 people, roughly, were packed into that. And it does matter to us a little to explain how Swansea worked. Swansea was a private borough. It belonged to the Beaufort family. It had belonged to the Earls of Warwick, and the Beauforts eventually inherited all their titles and powers. And they shared power with the free men of the city, people to whom they had at one time or another granted the freedom of the city. And in 1800, there were less than 100 of them. And they were the only electors of a Member of Parliament, plus the aldermen of the city who actually ruled the city. And there were only 20 odd of them. Now the reason there were very few was that the free men of the city were granted lots and lots of rights. And the most profitable of those rights was any ship putting into the port of Swansea here, where we're standing, had to pay the city. Because the city owned the banks and the city owned the staging port, the stages where they unloaded. And the burgesses took a cut. So they weren't very keen to admit more and more burgesses. They weren't in favour of democracy. They were in favour of a small group of people who shared out the profits, and they did very well out of it. And they were doing very well in 1800. The reason they were doing well was really what this walk is about. Up the valley, there is lots of coal. Lots and lots of coal. And it isn't just there, it's very close to the river. So that the port of Swansea sent out agricultural goods and all the rest of it, like any of the other South Wales ports, which were all quite small. But it, above all, began to export coal. So every coal barge that came down, unloaded into a ship, paid pennies to the burgesses of Swansea. Literally put money into their pockets. So they were not keen to change things. But a big development took place in the course of the 18th century, which put even more money into their pockets. I mean, this was, you know, if you were a burgess, you really only had to sit there and do the accounts. That was all. And that was copper. Swansea later became known as Copperopolis, the city of copper. And there was no copper in Swansea. the nearest big supplies of copper were across the water in Cornwall. But the reason why Swansea became the big copper centre was simple arithmetic. To produce 1 ton of pure copper, you needed 12 tons of copper ore, and that meant you needed to ship it by sea because it would be too expensive by land. And you needed 32 tons of coal. So the copper had to go to the coal, not the coal to the copper. So although there was no copper here, copper poured in through the port, was taken in 30-ton barges up the Tawe, which is navigable for ships of that weight, up to Morriston, and sizable copper works developed up in the valley. The burgesses of Swansea didn't give a damn about this because all they did was take the money, and they invested almost nothing in the port. They didn't care about the pollution, which was hideous in the valley, because Swansea is to the west, so the prevailing wind blew all the nasty sulphurous fumes away from Swansea, and Swansea thought of itself as the Brighton of Wales, and it advertised itself as the Brighton of Wales. Literally, they put out pamphlets into England saying, come to Swansea for healthful water, which was quite untrue incidentally, and beautiful airs. This despite the fact that the Swansea Valley was producing foul copper. The people of Swansea, the burgesses, did nothing or very little for the port, except the copper masters started to push them. Now, where we're standing is the mouth of the Tawe, and you get a completely false impression of what it was then like. The Tawe wound across this area. It was little but marsh between what we call the Strand and St Thomas and Fabian Way over that way. This was all marshland in which the river flowed. And the river had sandbars, and on the sandbars on the sides of the river were lots and lots of staging posts where ships could unload. Quite a lot of them. And they were all owned by the city of Swansea, which was just taking the money and distributing it to the burgesses. This was a very inefficient way of importing copper ore because it had to be transshipped. And it also meant that big ships coming in, 200 to 300 tons were big in those days, had to settle on the bottom at the low tide. And that often damaged them. They often sat onto a rock or some stuff that somebody had thrown into the river, and it made them difficult to load and unload. So what Swansea really needed was a dock that would admit ships on the high tide, the lock would close, and then they could be unladen at leisure in the dock. That's what we normally consider. But the citizens of Swansea, or at least the burgesses, opposed that because they didn't want to share money, they didn't want to invest, and they didn't want to share money. But they were, in the end, abolished by the 1832 Acts, which made British cities into not a democracy, but at least made them somewhat democratic. And gradually pressure built up to build docks. And the reason we're standing in this unprepossessing dump by Toys R Us is that this is the first dock in Swansea. The first dock opening on the high tide, closing on the low tide, where ships could be unloaded as they floated. And it was simply a meander of the river. We're now standing on the west bank of the river's over there. In 1800, we'd have been standing probably on a sandbank in the middle of the river, but certainly more towards the west bank of the river. Certainly we would be on the east bank of the river. So what the Docks Board did when it started was to cut off the Tawe just above High Street Station, and in a great oxbow which ended about here, they simply cut it off and straightened the river to roughly its present course, although not on the east side, which remained a marsh largely, and that created the first dock. So we're standing on it, that's why I've started here. The reason you're not up to your neck in water is rather different. This dock closed in 1928. It was built for wooden ships of 300 tons. It couldn't cope with modern ships by the 1920s. It had been running downhill for a long time, and it simply closed, and it was here more or less stagnating for a long time. In February of 1941, Swansea was Blitz, the famous three-day Blitz. And ultimately, most of the rubble from that three-day Blitz found its way down here to the North Dock, which was filled in. So what you're standing on is the North Dock area, but you're actually standing on old Swansea. The Swansea which existed down to the Second World War. That's what you're standing on, and that was why it was how it was filled in. So this was the first of the docks. Now what we're going to do is walk across the road towards the more modern docks across the river. We're going down to the sail bridge and then across to the modern docks, and I'll talk about what they were built for. We're going to end up at the South Dock, which was actually the second dock. This was built in 1852. It took a hell of a long time to build. The Act of Parliament empowering it to be built was built in 1832. It took 20 years to get it going. But the South Dock, which we're going to end at, was built in 1859. And those two docks between them saw Swansea rise to being one of the biggest ports in the country. It also saw it rise to be Copperopolis, where the world price of copper was fixed here in Swansea at the Mackworth Hotel in the High Street, to such an extent that by the 1830s the deposits in Cornwall were running out. Paris Mountain was carried virtually ton by ton from Anglesey right around here, and that was worked out, and copper was pouring in from Australia. The first Australian load came here in 1836, and above all from Chile. So that Swansea became the centre of world copper, and in 1860 it was more or less producing 60% of world production of copper. So that's why Swansea is known as Copperopolis. It's an enormous production. So we're going to walk past various sites, first across the road by through Sainsbury's, I'm afraid, or past Sainsbury's, and onto the riverbank, and then across to the east side, which didn't exist till really as a port area, because it was just, Fabian Bay was largely marsh, and we'll see what they did to it rather later, and I'll explain why they did it. So these two docks, the north and the south, served the great Copperopolis of Swansea right through the 19th century, and that was where the copper came in. And you're standing really in one of the key points of industrial development, not just in Swansea or just in Wales, but in Britain as a whole, because Britain was the centre of that industrial revolution, and copper was really absolutely vital to it. Right, we'll set off across the river, across the road. Do be careful, because then we'll cross the river.